thank you very much for joining this special briefing today on the day when Rishi Sunak has been appointed as the Prime Minister, the youngest Prime Minister for more than 200 years, the first British Asian and the first Hindu to hold the job. And so we're going to be discussing with a panel the significance of this role and the impact on the British Hindu and South Asian community, whether it really does indicate that faith and race diversity is the new normal. So the panel, introducing you, Sundar Katwala, the Director of British Future, Professor Chakravarthi from Prasad from Lancaster University, Akandadi Das, Director of the Science and Philosophy Initiative linked to the US. I'm never going to pronounce this, Akandadi. You can introduce yourself a bit later on. Nilesh Solanki, PricewaterhouseCoopers Hindu Network founder, and Tilak Parekh, one of the RMC advisors, a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. So thank you all for joining. Professor, can I start with you? You at Lancaster University, Professor of Comparative Religion and Philosophy. Can I just ask you, first of all, for the significance of this appointment, the first British Hindu to be appointed Prime Minister? How significant is that for British society?
I think the larger significance at a fairly abstract level is not so much about Rishi Sunak being a Hindu as the fact that he is the first person of color to head a government in a European country, or indeed in the West, apart from, I think, Ireland. To the extent that we might find it difficult to think of Germany or France or the Netherlands, or indeed at the moment Italy, having a person of color as the head of government, it is an extraordinary statement about the diversity of British society. And I think Sundar has written about it and probably will come in with some comments on that. So for me, I think that's much more important. As far as Sunak being a Hindu in particular, I'm not sure whether that has a great bearing on the kind of crises confronting this country, nor indeed do I think that it is going to have a huge impact outside the normal geostrategic considerations of relationships with India. Certainly, there will be large sections of Britain's population from non-white backgrounds, and of course, certainly Hindus, who would feel that there is a personal story involved. But what we should keep in mind, of course, is that political success comes from people making an identification in some way with their politicians. Yesterday, I was hearing somebody from the Northwest, a small business owner, who said that he found it difficult to relate to Mr. Sunak, that he thought that with his own privileged background, he did not really understand people like him. And when the interviewer said, well, couldn't you say the same about Boris Johnson? This person replied, oh no, Boris is down to earth and really understands who we are, which from any kind of socioeconomic perspective, of course, makes no sense at all if both went to expensive private schools and then on to Oxford. What, however, had worked was that there was a section of the British population, and I will not comment on the undertows of why it is that this person found it difficult to relate to Mr. Sunak, but did to Boris Johnson. The point is that people make that strong sense of identification, and that happens in politics all the time. We saw the kind of groundswell in American society during the election of Barack Obama, which now we found in the Trump presidency to be impossible to look back on and understand as any fundamental shift in social attitudes. So it's the same here. The shift in social attitude is the importance of the fact that Britain has been able to appoint somebody who is not white, albeit somebody coming from a very conventional political sort of educational background for politics in the British Parliament. However, to the extent that he is able to invoke a sense of identification with people of his ancestral religious tradition, I think Sunak will be seen as more important to Hindus in all that diversity in this country, let alone in India or around the world, than might perhaps be borne out by the actual political contingencies which he faces.
Just going to Sunda Katwala, thank you. Would you agree? You said it shows how race and faith diversity is the new normal in British politics. So it's not just a blip.
No, this is a new norm, and that's important, and that's the reason that this historic moment, I think, piece of social history is also a very understated piece of social history in Britain. There's a lot more focus in the Indian media on there being a Hindu Prime Minister of Britain than there is in the British media, and there might be more surprise maybe in America or Europe as well. So it's a new normal in Britain, but it's a very recent new normal. And so when we asked the question ahead of the Jubilee, just hypothetically, an ethnic minority prime minister, what do you think? And 6 out of 10 people said it's irrelevant, we shouldn't notice, and a quarter of people said it would be good, and 1 in 10 said they thought it would be negative. And the ethnic minority responses were a little bit more balanced between irrelevant was still, the plurality winner, with it's good as well, because in different ways it's irrelevant and it's good. Those are both sensible answers if you're not in the it's bad. But in a way, the white British perspective is to say, well, if we're meant to treat everybody fairly, maybe we shouldn't discuss it. Maybe it's important to not discuss it. But when I say it's a new norm, it's a new normal since about 2019. I think because of the chaos in our government, we have had so many ethnic minority chancellors and home secretaries, 4 chancellors, 3 home secretaries, 5 or 6 years, that everybody thinks, well, this was just the next step. And that was true. But that was absolutely not true 10 years ago. And so if we're not going to notice, we should at least notice how we got to that point. And everybody is very, very surprised to hear how recent it was. So there were 3 Black British cabinet ministers under New Labour starting in 2002. But the very first British Asian cabinet minister was Saeed Ovasi in the House of Lords for David Cameron in 2010. And so there would have been no MP able to stand from the cabinet until Sajid Javid was the culture secretary in 2014. That's the very first British Asian cabinet minister in 2014. So this plethora of people right at the top, it's a very interesting, rapid change in British politics. We had no public voice of Black and Asian Britain in public life, in politics, for 40 years after the Windrush. We then had very gradual progress from 1987 to 2010. If you ask, why did it take so long? In selection meetings of the Labour Party, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, people were having the conversation saying, we should be very fair to all of these candidates, but I just don't know if the voters will be ready. And outside of highly diverse inner city seats, all of the parties were having that conversation. David Cameron broke that, and he actually thought, I'm not going to win inner city London, inner city Birmingham. I need to have ethnic minority candidates in the safest Conservative seats. He actually went for the safer seats. He wasn't sure. He thought the voters might be prejudiced at the 3% level. So he broke something quite important. So that was important. The interesting question of the lack of discussion of Sunak's Hinduism is very, very interesting, I think. He is the first non-Christian practicing prime minister of a non-Christian faith. We have had Unitarians, we have had atheists, we have had agnostics. We have had one Roman Catholic who couldn't really come out as Roman Catholic until he left office, in Tony Blair, who then converted formally afterwards. We had another Roman Catholic that nobody thinks takes his faith very seriously as a Roman Catholic, which is Boris Johnson, who seems a more sort of Hellenic follower of the Greek gods, I think, if anything. But Boris Johnson was then under a legal prohibition that does not apply to a Hindu in the formal role of the prime minister. There is anti-Catholic discrimination on our statute book that says that the powers are very limited now. Gordon Brown reformed it so that there is no real discretion. When we're watching old episodes of Yes Minister and you're choosing between 2 bishops, you're now choosing one bishop, and there is a backup choice if they have to resign. So if Sunak was coming to office and we had the old system, you'd have to decide, can he just make the decision in the public interest? Does he need to take advice? Does he need to delegate it? There's nothing really to delegate now. So what's important symbolically about a Hindu prime minister as an example of a non-Christian prime minister rather than a Hindu specifically is it fits very much with the new King's approach I think, which is that he's the head of an established church and he has a duty to all of the diversity. And so I think it helps the king that he will be the king at his coronation and have a prime minister who happens to be a Hindu, not a Hindu prime minister, but a prime minister who happens to be of the Hindu faith. That's important for the king's multiculturalism, that he has a community of communities approach to multiculturalism. So it's important symbolically, but it's not important practically. But Britain is so kind of secular.
Just
that
briefly
it doesn't ask. Sure.
Just briefly before we move on, as a point in the chat box, we have had a Jewish prime minister before.
But he was Anglicized. He converted to Anglicism. It was important to him to be Jewish, Disraeli, in his heritage and so on. But it was important to Disraeli's father, and he would not have been able to enter public life in the 1820s and the 1830s had he not been an Anglicized Jew who converted to Christianity. So in a way, that is progress across 2 centuries, that the assimilationist pressure on minorities does not exist now. And Sunak is not a kind of, well, I'm of a faith heritage, but I don't have that faith. He is a practicing Hindu. And so that's important.
We are going to talk about Hinduism, Sundar, just bringing in another guest. Akan Dadayi Das. You have to explain what you do. You used to run the manor in Hertfordshire, and now you're a Thought for the Day contributor, apart from anything else in your life. And you gave the Thought for the Day yesterday on Diwali. Can I just ask you, or pick up some of those points, or ask you to pick them up, that Sundar Katwala was making there, that we're not talking much about his Hinduism, it's more about the fact that he was a British Asian. Okay, so how important is his faith? Because he is a committed Hindu from various accounts. How important is that going to be in the way that he conducts the office? What impact will that make on his character? Just explain the faith.
Okay, I think it is significant to have a Hindu as our first kind of ethnic leader in this country. I think that Hinduism at its core really strives to be universal, to be objective, to be neutral, to see everyone equally. Now, this isn't always as it is practiced, or when it's shown in India, there's certain aspects where it does look rather sectarian at times. But I think that in Britain, there is much more a sense amongst committed Hindus that the Bhagavad Gita calls on them to see equally, to treat equally, to be fair, to be open, to be compassionate, and to see oneself as a servant of God and the community, and therefore to extend oneself as best as possible for everyone. And I think that's could be very important in a time when we really have difficulty economically, when we're going to have to make, as we've heard, eye-watering decisions on taxes and cuts. How will this be apportioned? And I would like to think that Rishi will draw on his Hindu background and consider that it has to be done in the fairest way and not seen to benefit the privileged or the rich. I think if there is a negativity towards it, it's not because of his ethnicity or his religion. It's possibly because of the wealth that he has, which is so unimaginable for the common person that it may seem that he lives in a different world. But he has come through a very traditional immigrant kind of history with his family in Southampton. And just through hard work, graft, entrepreneurship, and his own intelligence and skills, he has worked his way up. So I think that it would be wrong not to think of him as someone who can identify with the public. So I hope his Hinduism is able to draw on that. I think there's another aspect. We know that he's a teetotaler. We know that he acknowledges many aspects of his culture and the practices. And I think that frees up a person both in time and in focus to concentrate on the big issues. Whereas when one, and maybe for many of us, when we are more absorbed in kind of pleasure pursuits in this world, that can be quite a distraction. So I hope that he is able to focus and apply the intelligence that he has in a broad way to address the big problems of our society.
I'd just like to ask you one question. There was a fabulous report actually in the Metro about the family temple that his grandfather started in Southampton, and apparently he goes back there once a year and makes a meal. It's a family tradition, and so I looked it up, and it's a purpose-built modern building. I don't know if any of the panelists have been there. Anyone on the call? And it's full of community activities, obviously lots of colour, food, community events, dancing. And I'm wondering how important that heritage is. A friend of mine was saying that, her family doesn't practice their religion in the temple. They have a shrine at home. For them, that's sufficient. That's an expression of their faith. But for this place, this faith, which seems to be rooted in community, what kind of difference does that make? I can ask you again, Akandadi.
Yeah, it's typical that in many, many Hindu homes, they have a private shrine. I do within my home for the family, and it's where prayers are said and where offering of our daily food is made before we eat. And that would be very typical. I think many families will light a candle or a diva each morning and recite some mantras. That would be typical. But at the same time, there is the call to extend oneself to a broader field than just one's family, and to the community. And I know a number of Hindus throughout the country who really extend themselves first, either by opening the doors of their home and inviting people to share the arrangement that they've got. And sometimes their home shrines are just absolutely stupendous and inspiring. And it seems that Rishi Sunak's family also really value the importance of bringing the community together and inspiring them in order to appreciate the value of their cultural and their heritage. And I have to say, the knowledge and the philosophical outlook that I think Hinduism brings to these individuals.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce the next two members of the panel, and then I would ask people to ask questions, put them in the chat box, and we can have a discussion. But introducing Nilesh Solanki, the founder of PricewaterhouseCoopers Hindu Network, and Tilak Parak from the University of Cambridge. So can I ask you both questions from the people in your community, the people you meet, your own reaction? How big an impact is it's making on you, on your community? You're going to stand for office. Does it give you new hope in the political system? Nilesh, perhaps go to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy Diwali to everybody. Look, it's absolutely significant for young British Hindus, young professionals. It's very significant in terms of, especially on Diwali, a Hindu prime minister being appointed, but also for the sort of Indian diaspora as well. This actually signifies breaking glass ceilings. And if I was to bring in various other sort of corporate leaders as well, from Microsoft, Google, etc., where is this success or the willingness to give come from? And I think it comes from our tradition, our culture. And like Akandidasaji said, is Hinduism and our culture. Various words connect with that culture very, very intimately, and those are things like inclusivity, diversity, and seva. And what you touched upon, Ruth, about Rishi's family giving back to the community back home down south, is all about seva and that service. And there's various, I'm no scholar, but there's various Sanskrit shlokas about sarve bhavantu sukhinaha, etc., how we can give back to the community, etc. So this actually gives a proud sort of feeling for especially young British Hindus and Indians, that they feel empowered, they feel aspirational, that actually we're able to take the highest office because of our cultural values. I mean, Rishi took oath on the Bhagavad Gita. He's lit a candle outside, 10 Downing Street. And, he opened his first PM address. When opportunity to serve comes along, you cannot question the moment, you only question your willingness. And this actually highlights that he just wants to serve. He just wants to give back to the community because he's taken up this public office responsibility. So I think it's amazing that this has taken place, and I think even the British media and everybody else needs to just take that on, that it's actually your cultural values. If you can bring yourself even to your corporate. At PwC, I started Hindu Network 20 years ago, and the corporate has embraced those diversity and inclusive values. It enables us to actually bring our true selves, and Rishi's bringing his true cultural dharmic self to the fore, and hopefully will bring a change and a massive, diverse, positive change in the British community at large. He's there to serve the whole community. Him being Hindu brings his whole self to the whole British community, and hopefully the big in tray that he has of challenges, whether that's economy, strikes, Ukraine, etc. He'll bring his cultural values to that to make sure he's doing the right thing, the dharmic thing, and making sure that the British public are served well in his reign and his cabinet.
It's a very high bar. So yeah. Tilak, do you have anything to add to that? Your response?
Yep. I think, of course, everyone has different views on policy and politics, but as everyone has said, it's definitely a significant moment. And there was an article yesterday on the BBC, and I'm sure many people have seen their WhatsApp groups, especially in the Indian communities, have all been sort of celebrating this moment as well. And I think especially it's 50 years since Asians were expelled from Uganda, and to show within 50 years, that someone from Indian origin can become prime minister shows what the country's like. And I mean, just as reflecting today, we have a Christian king, a Hindu prime minister, a Jewish home secretary, and a Muslim mayor of London, which shows the diversity we have here, which is something to be proud of, I think, at this moment. And more than anything, I think, in terms of you were asking for the impact on the community, I think for the Indian community, it might also be a signal for more Indian young people to get involved in politics. Like I know for myself, at least, it's usually, in Indian families, it's you become a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. Of course, that's changing now. But seeing an Indian prime minister will definitely, I think, send a signal to the young people, young Hindus, young Indians, to strive to get more involved in politics or in public service and in the civil service. So I think that is definitely a good sign and a good marker as well. Of course, there's been a lot of talk of how Rishi Sunak is a Hindu, and just to, of course, clarify and qualify that Hinduism is, of course, a very diverse, I'm sure many people are aware, very diverse religion. And of course, I don't know, especially his individual beliefs and practices, but I'm sure his faith and his belief and culture may impact the way he leads the country as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Tilak. Keep us posted if you stand for election. Let us know. There's a question in the chat box. I don't know if there's Sundar, you'd like to take this one, from Mark Kellner. Question for the panel: is there concern that Mr. Sunak will either be overly detached from the recent conflict in Leicester? What do British Hindus want him to do about that situation?
I think the Leicester, disturbances, raise a lot of questions for society. I think what Sunak will not want to do is be seen to act as a prime minister, either in domestic tensions between communities or in the UK-India relationship. He won't want to be seen through the prism of what does the Hindu prime minister think. He will want to, be seen to operate, across communities. I think that will be quite important to him. Modi is sending a message saying you are the living bridge. At one level, he wants that to be true. At another level, he wants the relationship with India that Liz Truss would have wanted, that David Cameron would have wanted. There will be, I think, the really dangerous thing about Leicester, where we saw two groups of young men, going at the police, and then online, and they were small groups, and we saw efforts within Leicester to speak up for good relationships and calm it down. But external actors had negative, I think, and polarizing agendas, and managed to create two parallel narratives of a villain and a victim. And then in one set of narratives, maybe in the Indian media, you would find all on one side there were stories. On another side, you would find exactly the inverse point. It's possible to then situate Rishi Sunak in that narrative, to say what is his father-in-law's relationship with the Modi government, through sort of 3 degrees of separation. Can we make him a sort of object of suspicion, and not an honest broker in this, and to play that up? Now, that will not be the perception of British Muslims or British Sikhs or people of other faiths of Rishi Sunak. They will see him as the COVID Chancellor and the Prime Minister. But if people try and create that and situate him there, it makes it harder for him to do his job. So I think he'll have to find ways of managing attempts to do that. And the danger is that even if maybe 2/3, 3/4 of all minority communities are very much on the side of good relationships, the polarizing voices really have the dominant share of online voice, and we haven't really worked out how the bridges take on the polarizers online. I think Sunak will want to be a bridger for the national interest, not the representative of a community interest.
Ram, do you want to come back on that?
No, I just want to say that actually leads very nicely into the next question by Amardeep Basi, who says, Nilesh mentions how Rishi's victory means a lot to British Hindus. Does the panel think that the celebratory mood is mirrored by British Sikhs and Muslims in the UK? And I think it's important to think that while there might be a sense of identification of Rishi Sunak as a Hindu by Hindus, that doesn't in any sense at all, exactly as Sundar says, imply that he is somehow a Hindu prime minister, just a prime minister who happens to be Hindu. Yesterday, again, in one of these interviews, there was this young man, Hindu, and he said, well, I'm glad he's Hindu, but I'm still going to vote Labour. And that's exactly right. That I think it's perfectly right for people to say it's much more important that he's able to deal with the, cost of living crisis. What's he going to do with inflation? What's he going to do with these problems where, if you're broadly on the left, you're going to say this is a prime minister for billionaires. That's got nothing to do whether he's a Hindu or not. There can be Hindu values which are radically redistributive, which would not find this Hinduism particularly, relevant. So I think we need to peel apart the recognition of his background as a Hindu and thinking of him in any sense as a Hindu prime minister, which means that we need to be careful about what we think is being celebrated or not celebrated. And the same should extend to Muslims and Sikhs. He's not going to get into being a prime minister who's particularly concerned about following whatever that agenda might be carried in the name of Hinduism. In any case, we cannot identify what it would mean to be a Hindu in all of the diversity of Hindus, just as we have in the diversity of Muslims. So I think that the celebration is much more important, as Sundar was saying, about the diversity of British society, although there is a provocative point there that the great growth in leadership positions in Parliament is on the right, not on the left, although there are twice as many Labour people, MPs of colour than there are Conservative. And that might argue for the fact that actually the people of colour in the Conservative Party who have flourished have done so often by standing against what might be issues of solidarity in a more broadly sort of socialist or a redistributive left-wing approach, whereas it is much more difficult for people of colour, Hindu or Muslim or Black Christian, to stand out as much in the Labour Party, where the policies are broadly common. So we need to ask ourselves also why it is that this great growth, this uptick of people of color in positions of power in government has come very much on the right. The point I'm making there is that I think it has got much more to do with particular kinds of electoral appeals and patterns that have to do with economic policies, rather than about identity politics, even through the war on woke and so forth. So once we pull that aside, we should not think that British Sikhs and Muslims should be any more worried or less worried than Hindus should be celebrating or not celebrating that Rishi Sunak is the first Prime Minister of Britain who happens to be Hindu. It's much more important that we think that there are spaces for expansion for the diversity of the British population.
Thank you. Can I go to Suzanne Newcombe for the next question? Do you want to ask it in person, Suzanne? Thank you.
I was just wondering if the other panelists saw a potential for a changing understanding of how our society deals with religion and ethics, in that the kind of classical understanding of religions about a dogma, adherence to a dogma, and adherence to a particular leader, which is where the prohibitions against Catholics in government come from. But in having a prime minister who happens to be a practicing Hindu and might draw on that for making decisions, do you think there's a movement in our understanding about how non-affiliated people who are likely to come up in the next census and others who may have a more tangential but still draw upon religious traditions in a different way? Is there a changing understanding of religion and society being reflected in this choice?
I think actually it might be the other way around, that there has been a trend in a shift in the understanding of religion in British society, one of whose consequences has been the relative non-importance of Rishi Sunak being a Hindu, which is that there is this diversification of what it means to be religious, in terms of people's self-identification as, say, spiritual rather than religious, or what it means to have multiple religious affiliations, what it is to think about secular spaces as not militantly atheistic, but one that where cultural and racial identities stand proxy for religious diversity. These trends we have been seeing happening over the last perhaps 30 to 40 years in British society. So it's perhaps not surprising that finally politics too is showing this opening up, where the letting people be has become, in fact, the norm. I noticed that Ian Woolridge was asking, and I'd like to see what other people say about whether the incoming the Hindu identity of Sunak has got a bearing on how what would be the faith dimensions of the coronation of King Charles. And I think Sundar has already mentioned something about this, and I recall how Charles famously said at some point and drew a firestorm upon himself that he would like to be the defender of faith rather than of the faith. And I think some of those are now, I think it is important to note the historical coincidence that Sunak becomes Prime Minister in the reign of King Charles, when you have a king who has already expressed his interest in the diversity and what we might say, the spiritualization of private life in public spaces in Britain today.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on Suzanne's question. I think there is a change in how people are looking at morality as such. And I think the Hindu perspective of Dharma is interesting and may be helpful in that most people have tended to assume that morality is something imposed on them by others. It is rules or regulations, dogmas, etc., that you should follow. Whereas Dharma turns it to the individual and says, if you are to be the person you aspire to be, that you identify yourself as, what is it that makes it authentic to be that person? What type of attitude, what type of outlook, what type of behavior, what type of character do you need to be authentic to that role? So I wonder if Rishi Sunak will be considering that in his own terms, that I may be a Hindu, but really the question is, I'm now taking this identity as Prime Minister. That identity carries with it responsibilities which are in relationship to a whole country. What is it to be authentic to that role as Prime Minister? What do I draw on? How do I express that? And I think that dharmic way of looking at it is a little bit of a turnaround, which may suit many of those that were mentioned, the spiritual, not religious category.
Thank you. There is another question in the chat box, actually, about the links between Sunak and the Modi government. And the question is, there is a perception, not necessarily evidenced, in some of the communities on the ground that Sunak is influenced by the nationalist Modi government, which they believe has an anti-minorities agenda. In other words, his appointment, rather than uniting British South Asians, could be a flashpoint for all differences between them. I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up, whether you've detected that already. Is that one for you, Sundar?
Yes, I worry about this narrative being used. I think it's not. I think there's very little to justify it. I think if you want to be critical, you could be critical of the British government in general, including the Cameron government, that they have been too keen on the relationship with India and therefore underestimate the challenges they might put to the Modi government. I think that's a fair question. There are then specific Conservative MPs. Bob Blackman, the MP in Harrow, who has the largest population, where he's clearly open to that agenda on the right of the Conservative Party and its interest in having links with the overseas BJP and so on. And maybe Priti Patel, former Home Secretary, might sometimes be in that agenda. In 7 years in Parliament, Rishi Sunak has shown no interest whatsoever in that kind of agenda compared to his interest in, say, the farming agenda of North Yorkshire. And so while people could try to sort of have a sort of 3 degrees of separation argument, what pressure was his father-in-law put under? Can we position him here? I think it would be dangerous, and I think it's unfair. There's also a legitimate challenge to the British government. What do you do when there are human rights issues within, a democratic country like India, which now has questions of minority rights? Are we consistent in our approach when it's our friends? That is a good question for any British Prime Minister, including this Conservative government. But I would worry about that being seen through the lens of Rishi Sunak's Hindu faith.
I'd just like to interject here in terms of I think it's also important to ask the question where these narratives are coming from, and that's really important. Who's creating these narratives? Why make these links to this sort of right-wing agenda, etc. And I think more thorough research and investigation needs to be done in terms of who's behind all of this, because that's what's actually navigating either the British press or the press on this side, as well as people's minds and mindsets. I think it's getting warped in that sense, and I think more research or thorough research needs to be done around that, and to dispel this sort of right-wing narrative.
Thank you. We're drawing to a close, actually. I did say we tried to aim for 45 minutes. Can I ask you, Sundar, for the last question on this? What is the implication for the Labour Party? So the Conservatives have elected as their Prime Minister someone who is British Asian and Hindu. We've heard earlier about the number of councillors that there are from within the Labour Party. What has the Labour Party got to do to match the Tories?
I have a challenge the Labour Party and also a challenge the Conservative Party, which is that David Cameron was catching up with the Labour Party. All of the diversity was on the left, and all of the votes were on the left by 4 to 1. And you're half as likely to vote Conservative if you are Asian or Black than if you are white. And, if you look at the British Indian population, the demographics, the economic position, the Conservatives should be getting 40%, not 20%. And so David Cameron chose to diversify his party for that reason. He's diversified his party spectacularly well, but he hasn't actually picked up more votes by doing it. And that's a good thing, because it shows that people don't vote their skin color. If people voted their skin color, you couldn't have an Asian prime minister. And so if it's a naive thing to think that British Asians will vote on the characteristics of the prime minister, but it has changed the image of the Conservative Party. That's great. The Labour Party is better on community representation, having 40 MPs, not 20, as was said, but it mostly has its candidates in highly diverse areas. And I wonder if it's pigeonholing them. And we heard this at a fringe meeting of the Labour Party that I chaired, that you had people who are standing for council being told, don't stand for that ward. It's a whiter ward of Tottenham. You shouldn't be standing there. And that's crazy. You know, it can be, you know, you can say of Conservatives like Rishi Sunak or Priscilla in 99% white seats, or Kwasi saying, you're not bringing the community with you. And that maybe we want people rooted in communities, but we shouldn't say to British Indians, your job is to represent the Indian communities. Your job is to be a citizen of Britain and to represent the community, or to represent the national interest, or to talk about business. And with strength in numbers, we do that. Whereas when, for example, when Sadiq Khan was elected the MP for Tooting, I was talking to him at that time, he didn't want to be a Muslim MP. He wanted to be a Tooting-born MP, but he was the only Muslim MP in London when 7/7 happened. So he had no choice in that parliament. If we have 65 ethnic minority MPs, as we now have, people can make different choices to be close to communities, to not have that, you know, as their dominant lens. But the Labour Party puts people in a box and therefore has community representation rather than national leadership, in my view.
Thank you. Very comprehensive answer. Thank you very much to all the panel for spending the time with us today. Could I just make a plea that if you are on the call and from any branch of the Hindu community in the UK, could you send us your stories? Because it's very difficult to find out what's happening within your communities. So you've got our email address now. So do keep in touch with us. And thank you again for spending time with us to discuss this today. Watch this space, I think, this afternoon. Thank you very much.